Mass man. This is a subject that, or a part of existence about which I've always been ambivalent. Mass man is a term that Jung created, referring to collectivized persons. And it's sort of like mass man. Can't live with them. Can't have a social matrix without them, apparently, because conscious individuated people throughout history have always been in a minority. And right now, in 2024, we have collective psychosis going on the left and on the right, or what are called the left and the right. Who knows what those mean anymore. But we have mass man acting up and going crazy, which is how the nightmares of history are created. So that ambivalence is at a peak in many of us at the moment. View the light and dark aspects of humanity with clarity and compassion. Jung once said that if you walk down a city street, you will encounter every human type, from the caveman to the man of the future. Respect and honor those below you, those at your level and those above. It is easy to fall into sarcastic disdain for unconscious people. Guilty. But overindulgence in such contempt can become its own form of unconsciousness. An individuated person will tend to view what Jung called mass man with disdain and irritation. In the Harry Potter books, such folk are called muggles. Gurdjieff called them the Hostimus. I have certainly been guilty of this sort of disdain. Individually or in the aggregate, it's easy to be annoyed or even horrified by mass humanity's bustling, buzzing, acting out energy. Mass man is composed of unreflecting people who don't understand their historical moment, yet seem to be wholly defined by the present era. So, for example, in the 50s they wore saddle shoes and played with hula hoops, and that was in the 50s. In the 60s, they, wore love beads and had bell-bottom pants. And then in the 70s, they went to discos. And in the 80s, they did coke, and so on and so forth. And so they would seem completely, whereas you could see some old soul child, and they'll seem to have like this universal aspect to them, like you could see them in any era throughout history, while their parents, who may be younger souls, may seem completely defined by the particular decade in which you find them. Mass man are basically person-shaped creatures who seem to be living stereotypes. They aggregate together and produce much sound and fury, signifying nothing. But sometimes our view of such collectivized folk is lacking. We may have the classic out-group homogeneity bias. I know I've fallen into this, where we see members of our group as being relatively more varied than members of other groups. So, for example, I worked with an Hispanic guy named Pedro who looked so much like an Hispanic short mustached, working guy that, I would have seen on a city street, and like they would have blurred into the background for me. But because this particular guy was somebody I was working with on a daily basis for a few years and got to actually know his life was operatic. It had so much depth and mythos in it. But not that it makes me look good, but if I had just seen him on the street passing by, I wouldn't have thought, I would have seen him as a type and not as a individual person. In my sci-fi epic, Parallel Journeys, the character Andrew says, because he's a journalist specializing in long-form articles on subcultures, he says even people who seem stereotypical can turn out to be far more complex when you really get to know them. Collectivized people are as much a part of nature as stars, trees, or viruses. They are part of the cosmic design, and we need to accept them. Like many natural forces, they can be extremely dangerous. Easily manipulated, mass man has been used to create many of the bloody tsunamis of history. More often, mass man is merely mundane and a somewhat appalling spectacle to those of us of individualized consciousness. The individuated person must be alert to the many dangers and hazards created by mass man. You don't want to get trampled by a mob, and often it's best to keep your distance. When traveling amongst mass man, cloaking some of your differences may reduce risk. Another danger of mass man is allowing them to preoccupy your attention. Sometimes they can be appalling and fascinating, like the car accident from which you cannot avert your gaze. They tempt the individuated person into a stereotype stance of sarcastic disdain and lazy feelings of superiority. It's too easy to ridicule and feel superior to mass man, but those feelings can be their own type of collectivized laziness and stagnation. Feeling superior to unconscious masses can divert us from facing our own shadows, our mediocre and stagnant aspects. When highly individuated people meet, they can easily form a bond of mutual disdain for mass man, where mocking them can become a lazy and unproductive game of shooting fish in a barrel. Consider this an auspicious time to make your peace with collective energy. Allow mass man to go its way while you stay focused on your path.